Some of the most celebrated safety innovations in automotive history, features engineers specifically designed to protect you, were flagged as potentially lethal before they ever made it into production. Not obscure prototypes, not experimental tech that never left the lab. These were seatbelt designs that made it onto drawing boards, into testing facilities, and in some cases almost made it to your car before someone finally said stop. And here is the part that will keep you up tonight. A few of them actually made it through anyway, and people paid the price before regulators caught up. In a rollover accident, that seatbelt design would tighten around your neck instead of your chest. The physics were clear, the testing showed it, and yet there were meetings where people argued it should go forward anyway. When I get to number 14, you are going to want to write down exactly why it took 3 years and documented fatalities before that particular design got pulled. Some of these you will completely understand, some will genuinely shock you. And if you have ever trusted your life to a seatbelt without thinking twice about it, hit subscribe right now, because you are about to find out just how many versions of that belt nearly killed you before you ever buckled it. Number 1. The waist-only lap belt with fixed anchor points positioned at hip level. This was the original seatbelt design that made it into American cars starting in the late 1950s. Simple, 2 points, buckle across your lap and you are done. Engineers loved it because it was cheap to manufacture and easy to install. Drivers tolerated it because it was better than nothing. Here is what the testing showed before it was approved. In a frontal collision above 30 miles per hour, that belt would ride up over your pelvis and crush your internal organs. The force had nowhere to go but into your soft tissue. Your liver, your spleen, your intestines took the full deceleration load. They called it submarine effect. Your body would slide under the belt, and your abdomen would compress against it like a vice. By 1963, federal crash data showed thousands of internal injuries directly attributable to lap-only belts in accidents where a 3-point harness would have distributed the load across your chest and pelvis. The regulation that finally required shoulder belts did not come until 1968 for front seats, and 1974 for rear seats. What was lost? Absolutely nothing. This design had no redeeming features once the 3-point harness existed. It was just cheaper. That belt kept you in your seat and destroyed everything inside you in the process. Number 2. The automatic shoulder belt that detached from the buckle during deployment. This showed up in the late 1970s and early 1980s as manufacturers tried to comply with passive restraint laws without installing airbags. The idea was brilliant on paper. When you opened the door, a motorized track would slide the shoulder portion of the belt forward along the door frame. You would sit down, close the door, and the belt would automatically move back across your chest. You never had to think about it. Engineers flagged 2 problems immediately. First, the lap portion was still manual and most drivers never bothered to buckle it. Second, in certain crash scenarios, the motorized mechanism would release the shoulder belt entirely, ejecting the occupant through the windshield. Internal memos from 3 major manufacturers specifically noted this failure mode during testing. Belts went into production anyway, because passive restraint laws were coming, and airbags were expensive. By 1990, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had documented over 200 cases where automatic shoulder belts either failed to restrain the occupant or actively contributed to ejection. The regulation requiring integrated 3-point belts with airbag systems, as the primary passive restraint, went into effect for all passenger cars by 1998. What was lost? The convenience of not thinking about it. That was genuinely appealing. You got in, the car took care of it, and you drove away feeling protected. The reality was that you were wearing half a seatbelt and trusting a motor that could kill you if it glitched. Beautiful idea, genuinely dangerous execution, and illegal on any new vehicle today. Number 3. The single retractor belt system that locked both shoulder and lap portions simultaneously. This design used one retractor mechanism to control both the shoulder strap and the lap strap, which sounds efficient until you understand what happened during a side impact. When the retractor locked, it locked both portions with equal force. Your shoulder got pulled tight, your lap got pulled tight. But your torso wanted to move laterally during a side collision, and that single-point lock created a fulcrum right at your ribcage. The belt would not give, your ribs would. Engineers documented this during oblique crash testing in the early 1970s. Test dummies showed rib fractures and internal bleeding at impact speeds as low as 25 miles per hour in side collisions. The recommendation was to separate the retractor systems so the lap and shoulder portions could lock independently and allow controlled torso movement. Some manufacturers ignored it. The belts were simpler to install and saved about $12 per vehicle in production costs. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 209 was amended in 1981 to require separate retractor mechanisms with specific load limiters for shoulder belts. Modern seatbelts now use dual retractors with pretensioners that can sense the type of collision and adjust tension independently for shoulder and lap. What was lost? Absolutely nothing the driver would ever notice. This was purely a cost-saving measure that broke bones. no one misses it except the accountants who like the cheaper assembly. Number 4. The belt with the buckle mounted on the seat frame instead of the floor. This showed up in various vehicles throughout the 1960s and 1970s, particularly in sporty models where designers wanted a cleaner floor appearance. Mount the buckle on the side of the seat, let it move with the seat, and you eliminate the floor hardware. Looks great, photographs beautifully. In a collision, that buckle became a projectile. The seat frame would deform, the buckle would tear free, and you would have a heavy piece of metal flying around the cabin at whatever speed you were traveling when you hit something. Engineering reports from General Motors and Ford both flagged this between 1968 and 1972. The testing was unambiguous. Seat-mounted buckles failed in frontal collisions at a rate 4 times higher than floor-mounted buckles. They went into production anyway on specific models, because the interior designers won the argument. It was not until FMVSS 209 was revised in 1978 to require buckles to withstand a 5,000-pound tensile load while mounted to the vehicle structure, not the seat, that this design finally disappeared. Modern buckles are bolted directly to reinforced floor pan mounts, with specific load paths engineered into the chassis. What was lost? Cleaner interior aesthetics. Those seat-mounted buckles looked incredible in magazine photos, and they would rip out of the seat and fracture your skull in a 30-mile-per-hour crash. Number 5. The static belt with no retractor that you had to manually adjust every time you got in. This was the original shoulder belt design on cars that added them before retractors became standard. You would pull the belt across your chest, feed it through a metal adjuster, and tighten it manually. Every single time. If you gained weight, you adjusted it. If you wore a thick coat, you adjusted it. If someone else drove your car, they adjusted it. Engineers knew immediately this would lead to user error. Too loose and you would submarine under it. Too tight and you would not wear it at all. Compliance studies done in the late 1960s showed that fewer than 20% of drivers with manual adjust static belts actually used them correctly. The rest either left them too loose, did not wear them, or tucked them behind their backs to stop the chafing. The retractor mechanism, the spring-loaded spool that lets the belt extend and retract smoothly and locks during sudden deceleration, became mandatory under FMVSS 209 in 1972 for front seats. The difference in usage rates was immediate. Retractor-equipped belts saw compliance jump to over 60% within 2 years. What was lost? The feeling that you were actively securing yourself. There was something deliberate about pulling that belt tight and locking it down. It felt serious. It also felt annoying enough that most people just did not do it. That belt could save your life, but only if you actually wore it, and most people did not. The retractor fixed that. If you are the kind of person who wonders why things are built the way they are and what it took to get here, I have put together a complete timeline of every major seatbelt regulation, the crash data that triggered it, and the specific designs that were banned because they were killing people. It is organized by decade with photos of the actual hardware and excerpts from the engineering reports that flagged them. Grab it at the link in the description. Number 6. The 2-point shoulder belt that crossed your chest but had no lap portion. This was an experimental design tested by several European manufacturers in the early 1960s. The idea was that a shoulder-only belt would be more comfortable, and drivers would actually wear it, unlike the lap belts everyone hated. The testing showed the problem within the first round of crash simulations. With nothing restraining your lower body, a frontal collision would fold you in half at the waist. Your head would smash into the dashboard or steering wheel because your torso pivoted freely below the belt. The belt kept your shoulders back and let everything else fly forward. Internal Volvo documents from 1963 specifically noted that shoulder-only belts increased head injury severity compared to no belt at all in certain crash scenarios. The 3-point belt, which Volvo engineer Nils Bohlin patented in 1959 and Volvo gave away royalty-free to the entire industry, was already proving itself superior in every measurable way. By 1967, Sweden mandated 3-point belts in front seats, and the 2-point shoulder design was quietly shelved. No country ever acquired it. No manufacturer ever produced it at scale. What was lost? Nothing, because it never made it to market, but it came close. There were meetings where cost analysts argued that a shoulder-only belt was better than nothing and cheaper than a 3-point system. Engineering won that fight, barely. Number 7. The belt with the latch plate made of plastic instead of metal. This showed up in some budget vehicles in the 1970s as manufacturers looked for ways to cut weight and cost. Plastic latch plates were lighter, cheaper to mold, and would not corrode. In a high-load collision, they would shatter. The fracture point was around 3,000 pounds of force, which sounds like a lot until you realize that a 150-pound person decelerating from 60 miles per hour to 0 in the space of 2 feet generates over 9,000 pounds of force on the belt. Testing done by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety in 1976 showed that plastic latch plates failed in 40% of simulated frontal collisions above 50 miles per hour. The metal components of the belt would hold. The buckle would hold. The anchor points would hold, and the little plastic plate that connected your belt to the buckle would explode into pieces and you would go through the windshield. FMVSS 209 was amended in 1977 to require all belt components, including latch plates, to be constructed of metal or a composite material capable of withstanding a minimum of 6,000 pounds tensile load without fracture. Modern latch plates are stamped steel with specific geometries designed to distribute load and prevent stress concentration. What was lost? Lighter seatbelts, that is it. A plastic latch plate weighed about 4 ounces less than a metal one. That 4 ounces would kill you, but it did shave a tiny bit of weight. Cost savings, roughly 30 cents per vehicle. Number 8. The belt with the anchorage point welded to the body panel instead of bolted to the frame. This was a manufacturing shortcut that showed up in various forms from the 1960s through the 1980s. Welding the belt anchor directly to the thin sheet metal of the door frame or B-pillar was faster and cheaper than bolting it to a reinforced structural member. In a serious collision, the sheet metal would tear like paper. The weld would hold, but the metal around it would rip free, and your belt would detach from the car entirely. Engineering standards from SAE, the Society of Automotive Engineers, specifically called for belt anchorages to be attached to structural frame members capable of withstanding 5,000 pounds of force in any direction. Multiple manufacturers ignored this and welded anchors to body panels anyway. It was not until FMVSS 210, which went into effect in 1972, that anchorage strength requirements became federal law with specific testing protocols. Inspectors would literally pull on installed belts with calibrated hydraulic rams to verify the anchorages would not tear out. Modern belt anchors are bolted through reinforced steel plates welded into the unibody structure with load paths, engineered to transfer force into the strongest parts of the chassis. What was lost? Faster assembly and lower production cost. What was gained? Belt anchors that do not rip out of the car and kill you. Reasonable trade. Number 9. The inertial belt that would lock during normal driving movements. Early retractor mechanisms in the late 1960s and early 1970s were overly sensitive. Lean forward to adjust the radio and the belt would lock. Reach for something in the back seat and the belt would lock. The mechanism used a pendulum inside the retractor that would swing during deceleration and engage a ratchet to lock the spool. The problem was calibration. Set the sensitivity too high and the belt locked constantly, which was annoying enough that people would disable the mechanism or not wear the belt at all. Set it too low and the belt would not lock during an actual collision until you had already moved several inches, which defeated the purpose. Engineers knew the threshold had to be precise. Lock above 0.7 g-forces, remain free below that. Getting that calibration consistent across millions of retractors in varying temperatures, and after years of use, was harder than it sounded. Early units would drift out of spec and either lock too easily or not lock at all. FMVSS 209 was updated in 1981 to require specific sensitivity ranges and durability testing over 5,000 lock cycles. Modern retractors use dual sensing mechanisms, both a pendulum for vehicle deceleration and a centrifugal clutch for belt webbing speed, so the belt locks if either the car stops suddenly or you move forward suddenly. What was lost? Simpler retractors with fewer parts. What was gained? Belts that do not strangle you when you lean forward and do not fail to catch you when you need them. Number 10. The 4-point harness installed in production passenger vehicles. This showed up in a handful of high-performance sports cars in the 1980s and 1990s. The idea was borrowed from racing: 2 shoulder straps and 2 lap straps all meeting at a central buckle. Maximum restraint, looks aggressive, feels serious. In a street car, it was a disaster. 4-point harnesses require a specific seating position, a roll cage to prevent roof collapse, and a hands device to prevent basilar skull fracture during sudden stops. Without those things, which no production street car had, the harness would hold your torso completely rigid while your head whipped forward and snapped your neck. Racing drivers knew this. They wore helmets and neck restraints. Street drivers did not. Additionally, 4-point harnesses require both hands to release in an emergency, which made post-crash egress nearly impossible if you were injured or disoriented. FMVSS 209 has never allowed 4-point harnesses in passenger vehicles without supplementary head and neck restraint systems, which is why you have never seen one in a factory street car. The few that came close were either show vehicles or required dealer-installed downgrades to 3-point belts before delivery. What was lost? The aesthetic and the feeling of being strapped into something serious. A 4-point harness looks like you mean business. On a racetrack with the right equipment, it works. On the street, it is a neck breaker, illegal in production cars, and it is staying that way. Number 11. The belt with no emergency locking retractor that remained loose at all times. This was standard on some rear seat installations well into the 1980s. The belt would extend and retract, but it had no locking mechanism at all. It was just there to keep you vaguely in place. In any collision, you would move forward until the belt ran out of webbing, and then the retractor spring would try to pull you back. That spring was not designed to stop a human body moving at highway speed. It was designed to keep the belt tidy when not in use. Rear seat occupants in cars with non-locking retractors experienced ejection rates 3 times higher than front seat occupants with proper ELRs. The mechanism was not complicated. The technology existed. It was just cheaper to install a simple retractor in the back and let rear passengers take their chances. FMVSS 209 was amended in 1989 to require emergency locking retractors on all seating positions, front and rear. What was lost? The ability for backseat passengers to move around freely while the car was moving, which parents of small children actually appreciated because it kept the kids entertained. What was gained? Rear seat occupants who did not fly through the windshield during a crash. Modern rear belts lock just as firmly as front belts and have the same load limiters and pretensioners in many vehicles. Number 12, the continuous loop belt system, where one belt served both the shoulder and lap with no separation. This design used a single length of webbing that looped through guides and formed both the shoulder and lap portions. Adjust one and you affected the other. Pull the shoulder portion tight and the lap belt would loosen, tighten the lap and the shoulder would go slack. Engineers called this design during the 1970s, and the testing showed that occupants could not achieve proper fit on both portions simultaneously. The shoulder would either be too loose and allow forward movement, or the lap would be too tight and cause abdominal injury, or vice versa. The geometry made it impossible to get both right. Separate webbing for shoulder and lap portions became standard practice by the early 1980s, and FMVSS 209 effectively required it by specifying independent load requirements for upper and lower torso restraint. Modern three-point belts use a single piece of webbing, but it passes through a D-ring or sliding latch plate that allows the shoulder and lap portions to adjust independently. What was lost? Slightly simpler manufacturing. One continuous loop is easier to install than a webbing system with a sliding latch. It also did not work. That belt would fit you wrong every single time and there was no way to fix it. Number 13. The belt with a manual locking retractor that required you to pull it all the way out to engage the lock. This was installed in some rear seating positions and in vehicles designed for child seat installation. The mechanism worked like this: pull the belt all the way out until it stopped, then let it retract, and the retractor would lock in place and prevent further extension. This was intended to allow you to secure a child's seat tightly. The problem was that most users did not know this feature existed, and even those who did would forget to engage it. Additionally, once locked, the belt stayed locked until you manually released it by unbuckling and letting it retract fully. If you got in the back seat and buckled a manual locking retractor belt without pulling it all the way out first, you had a loose belt that would not tighten or lock during a crash. Compliance studies in the 1990s showed that fewer than 10% of child seats installed with manual locking retractors were installed correctly. The switchable retractor, which acts as an emergency locking retractor for adults and can be switched to manual locking mode for child seats, became the industry standard by the late 1990s. Modern vehicles use either switchable retractors or dedicated latch anchor systems that eliminate the need for belt-based child seat installation entirely. What was lost? Nothing of value. This was a feature almost no one understood and almost everyone used incorrectly. Number 14. The pyrotechnic pretensioner system that could deploy without a collision. This is the one I told you about at the start. Pretensioners are small explosive charges built into the seatbelt retractor that fire during a crash to instantly remove slack from the belt webbing before your body moves forward. They are standard on almost every vehicle built after 2000 and they save lives. Early versions had a problem. The sensors that detected a crash and triggered the pretensioner were sometimes too sensitive or could be triggered by electrical faults. Between 1995 and 2003, there were over 400 documented cases of pretensioners deploying without a collision. The belt would suddenly pull tight with several hundred pounds of force, which could crack ribs if you were leaning forward, or cause loss of vehicle control if it happened while driving. 3 fatalities were directly attributed to pretensioner misfires, 2 from loss of control and 1 from a medical event triggered by the sudden chest compression. Engineers had flagged the sensor calibration issue during development, but early airbag regulations required pretensioners, and the technology was new enough that failure modes were not fully understood. By 2005, FMVSS 208 was updated to require redundant crash sensors and specific electrical isolation standards to prevent false deployment. Modern pretensioners use multiple accelerometers and will only fire if several sensors agree that a crash is occurring. What was lost? Nothing. This was a safety feature that occasionally tried to kill you. The new versions work correctly. No one misses the explosive seatbelt surprise. Number 15. The height-adjustable shoulder anchor that could be set too low and strangle you. This feature started appearing in the 1990s to accommodate drivers of different heights. A sliding anchor point on the B-pillar let you adjust where the shoulder belt crossed your chest. Set it correctly level with your collarbone and it worked beautifully. Set it too low and the belt would cross your neck. In a collision, that belt would crush your trachea. Set it too high and the belt would slip off your shoulder entirely. Crash testing done with the anchor in the wrong position showed that injury severity increased dramatically compared to fixed anchor at the correct height. The problem was not the adjustable anchor itself. The problem was that most people set it incorrectly and never adjusted it again. NHTSA studies from 2004 found that over 60% of adjustable anchors were set to a position that increased injury risk. There is no federal regulation banning adjustable anchors, but manufacturers have quietly moved away from them. Modern vehicles either use a fixed anchor position designed to work for the 5th percentile female through the 95th percentile male, or they use active seat belt systems that adjust automatically based on seat position. What was lost? The ability to customize your belt fit, which genuinely helped very short and very tall drivers. What was gained? People who did not accidentally strangle themselves because they set the anchor wrong once in 2003 and never touched it again. Number 16. The integrated child seat with a seatbelt that was not rated for adult use. Some minivans and SUVs in the 1990s came with rear seats that had built-in child booster cushions. Flip up the cushion and you had a booster seat. Fold it down and you had a regular seat. The seatbelt that secured the child in booster mode was the same belt you would use in adult mode, but it was routed differently and anchored at different points optimized for a small child. The problem was that the belt routing and anchor geometry that worked for a 40-pound child did not work for a 180-pound adult. In adult mode, the belt would position incorrectly and provide inadequate restraint. Several accidents in the late 1990s involved rear-seat adult passengers in vehicles with integrated child seats who sustained injuries consistent with improper belt fit. The belts were not technically defective. They were just being used in a way they were not designed for. FMVSS 213, which regulates child restraint systems, was clarified in 2002 to require that any integrated child seat use the same belt anchorage and routing as adult mode, or provide a completely separate restraint system for child mode. Most manufacturers discontinued integrated child seats entirely. Modern vehicles either have no integrated child seat at all or use systems where the child restraint is completely independent of the adult seatbelt. What was lost? The convenience of a built-in booster. Parents loved these, one less thing to install or forget, and the belt geometry was wrong just often enough to hurt people. Number 17. The seatbelt with no load limiter that would break your ribs to keep you restrained. Early 3-point belts were designed to hold you no matter what. The webbing would not stretch. The retractor would not give. In a high-speed collision, that belt would keep you in your seat and transfer every bit of the deceleration force directly into your skeleton. Broken ribs, fractured sternums, and internal injuries from belt compression were common in accidents where the occupant survived because of the belt. The belt did its job. It also hurt you badly in the process. Load limiters, mechanisms built into the retractor or the webbing itself that allow a small amount of controlled extension under extreme force, started appearing in the late 1990s. The idea is that the belt holds you firmly. But if the force exceeds a certain threshold, the limiter lets the belt extend a few inches to reduce peak loading on your chest. You still stay in your seat, you just do not take the full force all at once. Modern seatbelts have load limiters calibrated to allow extension at around 4,000 to 6,000 pounds of force. FMVSS 208 does not specifically require load limiters, but the injury criteria it mandates for crash test dummies are nearly impossible to meet without them, so every manufacturer uses them. What was lost? The absolute certainty that the belt would never give. Older belts felt like steel cables. New belts feel slightly softer, and they are dramatically less likely to break your ribs while saving your life. Number 18. The rear center lap-only belt that remained legal until 2007. This is the one that shocks people. The rear center seating position, the middle seat in the back, was allowed to have only a lap belt with no shoulder portion until the 2007 model year. Every other seating position required a 3-point belt by the late 1980s. The center rear got a pass because it was difficult to engineer a shoulder belt anchor point in the middle of the seat with no B-pillar or door frame to attach to. So for decades, the rear center passenger got the same belt design that was killing people in the 1960s. The submarine effect. The internal injuries, all of it still legal, still installed in millions of vehicles. Engineers knew, the data was clear. Rear center occupants with lap-only belts had injury and fatality rates 50% higher than occupants in positions with 3-point belts. It took until FMVSS 208 was amended in 2007 to require 3-point belts in all seating positions. Modern vehicles route the center rear shoulder belt to an anchor in the ceiling or the rear package shelf. What was lost? Easier packaging and lower cost. That center position was already the least desirable seat in the car. Adding the complexity of a shoulder belt made it worse for engineers. And the lap-only belt was a death sentence that regulators let slide for 40 years. Number 19. The seatbelt warning system that could be permanently disabled by buckling the belt behind you. This was not a belt design flaw. This was a regulatory oversight. Starting in 1974, vehicles were required to have a seatbelt warning system, a light and a chime that would activate if the belt was not buckled. The system checked whether the buckle was latched. It did not check whether a human was actually wearing the belt. Drivers who found the chime annoying would buckle the seatbelt behind their back or under the seat cushion, sit on top of it, and drive unrestrained. The warning system would never know. Compliance rates for seatbelt use remained below 50% through the 1980s despite the warning systems being mandatory. It was not until the early 1990s that more sophisticated systems started appearing that used pressure sensors in the seat to detect occupant weight and would not silence the warning unless both the seat was occupied and the belt was buckled. FMVSS 208 was updated in 2000 to require enhanced seatbelt warning systems that could not be easily defeated. Modern systems use weight sensors, belt tension sensors, and some even use cameras to verify the belt is routed correctly. What was lost? The ability to ignore the warning and drive without a belt, which is exactly what needed to be lost. That chime was annoying. It was also the only thing reminding half the country to buckle up. Number 20. The single-point release buckle used in some early three-point belt systems. Modern seatbelt buckles release with a single red button that unlatches the buckle and frees both the lap and shoulder portions simultaneously. Some early designs used two separate buckles, one for the lap belt and one for the shoulder belt. The idea was that you could release just the shoulder portion if you needed to reach something while remaining partially restrained by the lap belt. In an emergency, this was a catastrophe. Post-crash egress requires you to release your belt and exit the vehicle as quickly as possible. With two buckles, occupants would release one and think they were free, then struggle with the second buckle while the vehicle was on fire or sinking or filling with smoke. Accident reports from the 1970s documented multiple cases of occupants who drowned or burned because they could not figure out the two-buckle system under stress. FMVSS 209 was clarified in 1978 to require a single-point release mechanism for all seatbelt systems. The regulation specifies that the release button must be read, must be accessible with one hand, and must release all restraint components simultaneously. What was lost? The option to partially unbuckle, which had zero legitimate use cases and killed people regularly. Modern buckles are idiot-proof by design. One button, everything releases. No confusion. Every one of these regulations was written in blood, not theoretical harm, not potential risk. Actual documented deaths and injuries that happened because someone made a design decision and someone else paid for it with their body. Engineers flagged these problems, they wrote reports, they showed the test data, and in many cases they were overruled by cost analysts or told the regulation was not in effect yet so the design was technically legal. Next time you get in your car and that belt pulls smoothly across your chest and clicks into a single red buckle and tightens just enough to feel secure without choking you, remember what it replaced. Remember the belts that strangled, the buckles that shattered, the anchors that tore free, the retractors that did not lock, the load paths that crushed your organs, all of it gone now, all of it banned, all of it paid for by people who did not make it. Drop a comment and tell me which one of these you had no idea was ever a problem. And next time I am covering the safety features that manufacturers quietly removed in the last 10 years that you did not even notice were gone. Some of them you used every single day, or you used to.